Hello, everyone. Welcome to our discussion on communication. So, in the first sim that I uploaded, it was all about an introduction to communication. So, today we will review those topics and then we will move on to our next topic, specifically the topics under the unit learning outcome B. So, let us begin. Communication and introduction. So this lesson aims to describe the characteristics, process, and elements of communication. So what is communication? I know you are done with communication and the things about communication in your senior high school. So we will just have a refresher. So we will review what communication is. Moving on. So it is the basic requirement in the success of any individual because as what we have said, communication is the key to success. It is very important to have a productive society. We know that communication is the bloodline of the society because without it, society would not exist, right? So it involves the encoding, sending, the interpretation of the message from the speaker to the receiver. So that talks about the process of communication. Also, it helps us build connections with other people from different places, with different beliefs, customs, and cultures. And it will enable us to inform, persuade, and motivate the people around us. So that is communication. So in the ULO A, characteristics of communication was also discussed. Like communication is the bloodline of society, as what I have said. Without it, society would not exist. Because how could we convey our ideas? How could we make our society better? Even how could we make our society the best, right? If we do not communicate. So we really have to have communication. It is basic to success. It allows us to create networks and build stronger relationships. Because of communication, we can make our relationships better even if we are far from one another because we communicate whatever platform we use. So there is still communication. If there is communication, our relationship become better. Our relationships become better. Communication is everywhere. Another characteristic of communication. It is everywhere because whatever we do, wherever we go, we have to communicate. It is inevitable. Another one is it is a two-way process. It involves at least two people in the communication process, the sender and the receiver. So that is another characteristic. Another one is communication is complex. It is not simple. Others think that it is simple, but it is complex. Why? Because there are a lot of factors that we need to consider. There could be nonverbal messages. You have to listen to the emotions of the person while he or she communicates with the other person. So it is very complex. You have to listen to the meaning of the voice or the gesture, the body language of a person. So it is very complex. And lastly, communication is irreversible. So when we say irreversible, once you say something, you could not take it back. Thus, when we communicate, we have to be very sensitive. We have to feel what other people are feeling while we communicate to avoid miscommunication and to avoid chaos. So communication is irreversible. We have to think 100 times before we communicate. So those are the characteristics of communication. Moving on. This is just a review because I know you have already discussed this when you were in senior high school or in the lower years or in the lower grade. Communication process. So let us discuss this diagram. We will begin with the speaker. The speaker encodes the message. And then the message, as we know, this is the heart and soul of the communication process, because without the message, the communication becomes useless, because we communicate because we need to convey something. We need to say something, and that something is the message. So from the sender encodes it, the message is being encoded by the sender to the receiver, and then the receiver interprets it, and that is what we call decoding. And once the receiver interprets it, the receiver now becomes the sender. So the receiver encodes the feedback. So the message becomes the feedback, because this is already the response of the receiver from the sender. So this is the feedback to the sender. So the sender now becomes the receiver. So the sender now, or the new receiver, decodes the message or interprets the message. So this is the process of communication. Moving on. Another interpretation of this process is that, so these are the elements: the encoding, the message, the decoding, the receiver, the sender, the feedback or the channel. So the sender encodes the message to the receiver through a channel. It could be verbal, it could be non-verbal. And if there are barriers, there is noise, there are people shouting outside. So sometimes there are barriers. So if there are barriers, sometimes the communication process or the process is not effective, or the message is not perfectly received by the receiver. But if there is no noise, or if there are no barriers, then the message is will be successfully received by the receiver. So the receiver now decodes the message, and once he or she interprets it, he or she gives feedback to the sender. So the sender becomes the receiver through a medium. Again, if there is noise, so there is a barrier, so maybe the process will not be successful. But if there is none, then the process of communication is successful, or the receiver interprets it effectively. So that is another interpretation of the process of communication. Moving on. So these are the elements: the sender, the receiver, the channel, the encoding, decoding, feedback, and message. Again, message is the heart and soul of the communication process. Without it, the communication process is useless. You are communicating because you want to convey a message. So that is your objective. That is your purpose. Okay, so those are the elements of communication. So that ends. Now, let us have the next topic under the ULO B, or the lesson under the ULO B. So it is all about the types of communication. Again, please do not forget the lessons in the ULO A, because all of these lessons are interrelated. Hence, understanding of the previous lessons are very vital to understand the succeeding lessons. So we will begin with types of communication. So I know you know that there are types of communication. Communication based on the number of participants, communication based on the medium used. We will also discuss the ethics and the principles of communication. So we will begin with types of communication, and as what I have said, okay, so our purpose is to articulate, or the objective of this lesson is to articulate the types of communication, the ethics, and principles of communication. So to begin with, so these are the things to remember. Types of communication according to number or persons. We will also discuss types of communication according to the medium used, and we will be discussing ethics and principles of communication. So we will begin with types of communication according to number of persons. If you're familiar with this, these are the 5 types according to number. So those are intrapersonal, interpersonal, group, public, and mass communication. I know you have heard these things many times, so we will be reviewing these for you to know and for you to really understand what communication is. Moving on. So we will begin with the intrapersonal communication. So when we say intrapersonal communication, from the word itself, intra, that means self. That means you communicate within yourself, or you communicate. That is self-communication. That is when you meditate about something, when you think about something. So you communicate, you talk to yourself. And please be aware that talking to yourself is healthy. Okay, there is nothing wrong with talking to yourself, because that is what we call intrapersonal communication. That is also very vital. Next, interpersonal communication. So when we say interpersonal communication, from the word inter, that means it involves 2 people in the communication process. And those 2 people are the receiver and the sender. So interpersonal, we call it dyadic communication. So I talk to my best friend, I talk to my mother, or I communicate with my sister. So there are 2 people involved in the communication process. So there's interpersonal communication. Next one is the group communication. When we say group communication, there are 3 persons or people or more who are involved in the process. So what do you think is the difference between group communication and public communication? Because others have confusions about group or between group and public communication. Because it says here, public communication is quite similar to group communication. So what really is their difference? When we say group communication, the participants are all involved in the process. So that means they can actively participate in the communication process or in the conversation. However, why? Because they have the same interest. They know the topic. So that is group communication. However, when we say public communication, the speaker himself or herself dominates the process. That means the audience is only, or the audiences are only the reactor. So they clap their hands or they nod their heads. They can't really interact. They cannot really interact with the speaker. So for example, when the president of the organization speaks before the members of the organization, so that is public communication, because it is larger. The size of public communication is larger than the group communication. Remember, public communication, the speaker is the one dominating the process. But in group communication, everybody can actively participate in the process. Why? Because they know the topic. They are of the same interest. So those are the differences between group communication and public communication. And lastly, there is mass communication. As we all know, when we say mass communication, it is mediated mostly by technology. However, when we say mass communication, it could also be through newspapers. Why? Because people could not really gather in one place and listen to what the speaker says. So that is mass communication. So there is a mediation of technology. So for example, radio, broadcasting, or television, or people are watching via television, the speech of the president, just like that. So that is mass communication. If there is a mediation of technology, or if there is a use of newspaper, telephone, or other technologies, then that is what we call mass communication. Okay, in order to establish contact. So those are the types of communication according to number of persons or participants. I hope it is clear. If you have questions, you may write them, you may ask them, and you may post them in our open forum. Moving on. This is after the types of communication based on the number, we will have types of communication based on the medium that the participants use. Okay, so we will begin with verbal communication. There is a misconception, or a lot of people think that when we say verbal communication, it only it refers to the oral communication, because they said verbal siya, so it means oral. No, that is wrong. When I say verbal communication, it could be written or it could be oral. Why? Because verbal communication refers to the type of communication which uses words in the process or in communicating with one another. That means if there are words, written communication is part of verbal communication. Oral communication also is verbal communication, so do not be confused. When we say oral, that means spoken. However, when we say verbal, it could be written or it could be oral, as long as they use words when they communicate. So that is another type of communication based on the medium. Another one is, so written communication, again, that is verbal, and oral communication, that is verbal. Face-to-face conversation